So we have two speakers today. Myself, I'm Erin Harlow. I'm the horticulture agent in Columbia County. I've been here about a year, a little over, and I was in Duval County for 11 years prior to this as their horticulture agent. So now we also have Maxine on the Zoom today. Maxine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi guys, so I'm Maxine Hunter. I'm the Marion County Horticulture Extension Agent, and prior to being in Marion County for the last 3+ years, I was in Flagler County as their horticulture agent and master gardener coordinator there as well. So we're happy to be here today, and this is our first go around, so bear with us, but we're looking forward to it. So I hope you guys enjoy.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely not the way we like to do our vegetable gardening classes, and we miss seeing everyone, but we're glad for the opportunity to at least be able to connect with you guys and get a little bit of information out there to you. All righty, we're gonna go ahead and get started again. This is our vegetable garden design class today. And you can see our emails are there, so we'll make sure you get those if my computer will go. There we go. So our outline today is we're going to talk about the type of garden that you might be looking at starting this year. We're going to go over the site selection with you because that's very important. The planning, so do you want to do transplants versus direct sowing your seeds? We'll talk a little bit about companion planting. And so really, what do I need to think about when I'm going, when I go to plant, what am I have to think about? So it's getting you started today of really that process. You might be somebody that only has space for one tomato plant, and that's okay. Or you might be planning out a very large garden to keep your kids busy. That's okay too. So it's kind of a little bit for everybody here. We'll talk about the design process, some things to consider, and then we do want to give time for questions at the end. Okay. It takes it a minute to go. There we go. So first I want to talk about what type of garden do you want to have? And so this is when you start to think, okay, I want to be a gardener this year. You may have heard about our Victory Garden Program that we're doing, our community. So you may want to participate in that. There are so many ways that you can have a vegetable garden. So we kind of want to cover those. So there's obviously the traditional way. And a traditional way would be, you think rows in the ground, like you would if you were looking at a farm. That would be considered, or what we would consider, a traditional garden. An unconventional type could look like several things. We'll talk about foodscaping, which is honestly the way I kind of garden. I have a really hard time with traditional gardening. I don't enjoy it nearly as much. It's a good way, and I'll show you the pros and cons of it, but I will honestly say I'm an unconventional gardener just from my design standpoint, okay? So it may be foodscaping, or my garden tends to have a very organic look to it, and I'll explain that in a little bit. You might be somebody who wants to do raised beds, okay, which are, we'll talk about those too, but those are a great way if you want to have a smaller garden, if maybe you're gardening with kids or groups. If you want to just have a easy, accessible garden, so maybe you're somebody that doesn't want to bend over a lot, the raised beds are really a great choice for you. You might want to look into vertical towers. So you can see this photo here that we have. These are some of our vertical towers. In Columbia County, we have vertical towers in several of our schools through our Master Gardener program. And so this is one setup. I believe this is Richardson Middle with our 6th graders. And typically they grow strawberries. We do cucumbers with them, and they do lettuce as well. So we have several towers at, like I said, several different schools. It's a very, very successful program. This setup, you may not want to go quite this extensive though. So you may want to look into something a little bit smaller, but this one requires nutrients. And again, we'll go into these in details, but it is an option for you to grow hydroponically or vertically. You might be somebody who, just wants to start out really small and wants to do containers, okay? You might want to have a children's garden where, Maxine and I both have kids, and you know, we are looking for something extra because their schoolwork is not taking up all day, we are discovering. So having that little bit extra for them to do is great. And then you might have something else, another choice, and we'll look at those as well. All right, so let's talk about the traditional rows, and you can see a photo here of what it might look like. And this is, again, a very, very traditional way of growing our vegetables. When you think of a farm, this might be what you think of. So the advantages to having your garden set up like this, and we're starting like this because I think people think when they're gardening, if it's a larger scale, they tend to garden this way. If they're going to use machinery in particular, this would be usually the choice of design because you can get the machinery through the rows fairly easily. And proper spacing is fairly easy to achieve. It's easy to weed only because, again, a lot of times you are using machinery. It's easy to walk through the rows. So if you are doing mechanical weed removal, like using a hoe or something like that, it's, again, easy to get through. And you have that nice airflow because you are actually planting to typically specifications that you know, we're following on the labels of the seed packets or whatever. You can tell it's fairly easy to irrigate as well, which you have to think about irrigation and watering. So when you guys start to think, where do I want to put my garden? If you don't already have one, you have to think, am I going to be dragging a hose to it? Am I going to set up an irrigation system? This will really limit where you put it, and your design, you know, you might have the perfect spot on your property, but it's nowhere near irrigation. And then that becomes a limiting factor, and you really need to think, okay, maybe I need to look at a different place on the property that's not as good. Maybe it has some shade or heat issues, or the soil's not as good, but I have access to water. So keep that in mind. But you can see with the rows, pretty easy to irrigate because it's you can put out that drip tubing fairly easily if you were going to do a large area, or if you chose to do a raised irrigation like sprays where it's just spraying over the crop, then you know you're really condensing that area so you kind of can get that water where it's supposed to go. Some disadvantages, there is low creativity, and when I say that, again, I have a hard time with this one. I don't enjoy gardening this way because mine tend to look more like a landscape. My background is actually in public gardens management. So I come from a public gardens background, and I want it to look really, really pretty. And I garden, you know, and you have to decide, why do you garden? I garden because it makes me happy and I like it and it's pretty. If I get food out of it, it's kind of a bonus. So sometimes I get food and sometimes things fail miserably, and you know, it was pretty and I enjoyed it anyway. So you have to really kind of decide why you're gardening, okay? So this one is not great for creativity necessarily. So also I tend to be a plant collector, and I know several of you may be a master gardener. So, you know, or you might be part of the seed library or something like that, where you're with your friends and you say, oh, I have this plant and I have this plant, why don't we just swap? So then you end up with one or two of one kind and one or two of one kind. This method, the traditional rows, can be difficult for those of us that tend to walk around and collect plants and can't say no, because you know, you don't have one row of everything. And then of course you have those poor soil quality, and sandy soils are common in Florida. So you may have to amend these. That's typical for anything we're going to talk about. Okay. So an unconventional design, or you might call it foodscaping, that's a relatively, I don't want to say new term because it's not. It's been around a couple of years, but you can see a photo in this corner at the bottom. So foodscaping is where you're either taking your already existing landscape, okay, your ornamental landscape, and you're adding in vegetables to it. Or I also consider this the unconventional design. You might be designing your garden space to look more like a landscape. Okay, so you're really not planting in rows. You're planting more for the design aspect. So we tend to think of of color, and we might consider texture when we're doing unconventional design. For foodscaping, it's really, really great if you already have a landscape, especially if you're already irrigating, say, your flowers, and you're like, you know, I just want a couple of tomato plants, or I don't need to put a lot of work into it. I want to go ahead and add it in to my existing landscape. You certainly can do this, and it's a great way to get started, especially for those of us that do collect plants. I tend to say, oh, I'm out of space in my other garden. Maybe I'll just stick it in the front bed with my flowers. And then I end up with peppers, you know, all over the yard. There's nothing wrong with that. Something to consider, especially if you're in an urban area, this is a great way to incorporate vegetables into that urban area. Just keep in mind, if the plant starts to look bad, so, you know, maybe the sunflowers started to wilt, or the tomatoes at the end of the season and it just looks bad, go ahead and take it out, so that if you are, say, like in an HOA neighborhood or something like that, you know, you're still maintaining that garden and that space, but you're keeping it looking good. So advantages, it's great for that plant collector that, you know, you're swapping plants with your friends, you have a couple of these, a couple of those, and you may not get them all at the same time. So if you don't get all your plants at the same time, again, if you're like me, I tend to run out of space pretty quickly. And you'll see that in a minute. It's also fun to incorporate children areas, and I feel like this is a little bit easier for us to do if it's more like a foodscape or an unconventional design. My gardens tend to have winding pathways for people to explore. I might add in some of those children concepts that Maxine's going to talk about in a minute. Again, that opportunity to incorporate into existing landscapes is really, I think, important. I think as we move forward, especially if you're in an urban area, this is a great way, I'm telling you, to incorporate those vegetables in. And you can increase your biodiversity. There's a lot of people that are talking about that, and that's I don't say a new movement because it's not, but increasing that biodiversity in our landscapes and bringing back some food. We do get a lot of questions about pests and things like that. You know, keep in mind, if you are separating your plants so you don't have traditional rows like I showed you, some of the diseases and pests, it's harder for them to find your plants. So that does help, okay? Some disadvantages to this unconventional design, the plants can become crowded fairly quickly. So you may not be planting, you may be more like a square foot garden where you're putting a lot in that area. You may not be planting if your design is not, usually say about 4 feet, is if you can reach in 4 feet from both sides, that's a good distance for your beds, because at that point you can reach everything. But if you're doing an unconventional design, you might have a problem where your bed is a little bit larger than that, or you can't reach it from both sides. So sometimes it's hard to get to plants, okay? Weeding can be challenging, and then fire ants can also be a challenge, but honestly, that is in every single one of these. So if you live in the South, you know that, okay? All right, raised beds, these are a great way, and I think a lot of gardeners do raised beds or have a mix maybe of a little bit of everything, meaning a little bit of foodscaping and a little bit of raised beds. You can see this photo. These are probably 3x3s, 4x4s, something like that. These are nice, especially if you're doing any kind of community garden or if you're gardening with kids. I have a VA garden, which I'll show you in a minute, where we work with folks that maybe are restricted, have mobility. So we do use raised beds with them. And these are great options. If I'm going to do a raised bed, I actually prefer mine to be off the ground. And I'll show you in just a second a photo where I'm not leaning over on the raised bed. I'm actually standing up next to it. So I do like the tall ones because they are easier on the back. But you want to keep them shallow enough across where you can reach everything, okay? And then the irrigation is usually fairly easy to install for these because you can go right up to the side, and it's usually in some kind of grid pattern. So it's pretty easy. The disadvantages, eventually you're going to have to replace your raised bed. Okay, it's going to rot. We don't typically recommend I'm trying to think, railroad ties for raised beds. The newer ones you can use, but I still tend to stay away from those. So raised beds you are eventually going to have to replace. That's just the nature of it. Okay. And then the depth might influence kind of what you're deciding to grow. So when you're designing, you say, you know, I really want to be a carrot farmer. I want to grow lots of carrots this year. Then don't have, you know, you're going to have to consider, if I'm going to do all raised beds, consider the depth. If you're doing root vegetables versus something really tall, if your raised bed is already 3 feet off the ground and now you're putting a 3-foot tomato in it, can you reach that? So consider what you're growing and how you're going to grow it. That's going to influence your garden design. Okay. So just to show you some pictures, we're all kind of stuck at home. So really we're gardening with what we have at the house at this point. So that might influence your decision as well if you don't already have something going. So this is our VA hospital in Lake City that we're working with, and we're getting ready to actually change out everything on the left. You can see here, they had a lot of pots and containers, and their raised beds are fairly low to the ground. The photo on the right is actually their raised beds that are off the ground. And so in this case, because we are working with patients who have mobility restrictions, we've actually asked them to go ahead and build several more raised beds that are off the ground so that our wheelchair patients can reach them. And then anybody else that's in rehab, it's a little bit easier for them to reach those raised beds. But honestly, we find for the rest of us that are gardening with them, it's easier for everybody. We all prefer working in these raised beds versus these lower ones. But they're gardening again in anything that they have right now. This used to be a vertical tower that we took apart. These are containers that had some hot peppers and tomatoes in them. So don't be afraid to try different containers. It's not a huge space by any means, but they do get a lot of produce off of it. And remember, if you do have questions, make sure you're putting them in the chat box for us. Okay, Maxine, you want to take over?
Yep, I'll take over. All right, guys, so we're going to switch gears for just a minute, and I'm going to talk to you guys about a few different options that you can do with your gardens at home. So first of all, container gardening. So just like Erin mentioned at the VA, they've got some containers there that have some hot peppers. In the picture here, for those of you that have your video turned on, you can see potatoes growing in what was probably an old water trough that was reutilized. You can use containers from just about anything as long as it's a food safe source. So a lot of people like 35-gallon drums, 55-gallon drums. As long as they didn't have chemicals in it before, those are great. 5-gallon buckets. You have no idea how many containers you have until you start thinking about gardening. So I know my husband has taken over many of my containers that I had ornamental plants in, and he's taken over them for hot peppers, tomatoes, and blueberries. So all of these will do really well in them. Some of the advantages of using containers is they're good for small gardens, and they're excellent for getting started. They're very easy to manage all the way around, but they're especially easy for weeds and insects. You don't run into too many issues with them. Some of the disadvantages to containers is they dry out a little more quickly than like a raised bed would, or other sandy soils will dry out really quickly. But if you've got good soil and you water it early in the morning, it'll stay wet enough for the plants to do well in it for quite some time, whereas a container can dry out within a couple hours. And you are somewhat limited in what you can grow. Normally your root crops aren't going to do as well in containers as some of your fruiting crops, but you can be creative. Also, if you've got things that are growing up, so whether it be beans or squash, it can be hard to provide enough support for those in container gardening. So containers happen to be one of my very favorites because you can get all shapes, sizes, colors, you name it. They're not expensive. They're easy to change out. And when you get tired of something at the end of the season, use it in your compost pile and start over again with something fresh and pretty. You can also use typical design techniques such as your thrillers and your spillers to highlight around your vegetables if you are using it in your landscape. So for example, if you've got an upright determinate tomato growing in a container, you can use something trailing around the edge of that container to make it more aesthetically pleasing in your garden, as long as it's not something that's going to get too root bound and take over that space, because tomatoes will take up a lot of root growth. But there's lots of different options here, and containers to me are probably one of the most fun to play with, because you can continue to change things in and out and trial and error. So I've seen in many of our HOA communities where you've got soil pHs of 7.8, 7.9, you can't grow vegetables even if you have the space, but you can take containers and you can grow blueberries by adding the correct amount of pine bark and compost. And you can do that very successfully. So I think containers are one of the best options out there. Erin, if you can switch it over for me to the next one. Children's gardens. So as Erin mentioned earlier, we both have little ones at home. Hopefully mine won't come running into the picture during this lecture. I'll be really happy if we can make it through that. But children's gardens are one of the greatest things out there. And I will tell you that even though we talk about children gardening, you have to have the adults as part of that. Kids aren't going to go and do gardening on their own, so it's up to you to help guide them in the right direction. But if you have kids or grandkids, nieces or nephews, there's so many different things that you can do to engage them. So one of the things that you'll see here in the bottom picture is one of my very favorite things, and something Erin and I have talked a lot about it in the last few days. There's a kind of a blank soil spot that you can see both of Erin's kids and her puppy digging a big hole. So don't forget to incorporate spaces that you might not be worried about what's planted there. I can tell you my two daughters will go out with a glass jar. They have several very favorite containers, and they just sit there and fill them up with sand, dump them out, fill them up with sand, and dump them out. They do help me plant flowers. I will tell you, my youngest brought the pruning shears to me on Friday, and she had cut 2 flower stalks off of one of my succulents that only blooms once a year. So that happens, but it's okay. They were in her area, and she was all about it. They had not been relocated to where they were going to be located. But children's gardening can have a variety of different ideas. It needs to be interactive. So again, this is not supposed to be a super controlled environment. It's supposed to give them room to get their hands dirty and to learn and grow. For those of you that are in Marion County, you may also have heard your kids talk about the FANS program, which is the Fitness and Nutrition in Schools program. So in almost every school in our Marion County public school systems, we do have school gardens. This goes from the elementary school level, where we do raised beds, all the way to the high school level, where we have very expensive greenhouses with many different types of hydroponic systems growing. So this continues to go up with age. There's lots of creativity that happens in the garden, and you instill a love for gardening that can last them their whole lives. And that's something that we don't see enough of these days. Some other ideas: if you have a fence or a wall and you can add a chalkboard to it, that keeps them outside and keeps them engaged. Mailboxes are lots of fun. They can put all kinds of things in the mailboxes. Do be aware, though, in Florida we have lots of pests that will also take over those areas. So I know at our house we have several areas similar to mailboxes where they stash things, and we check them regularly for spiders, snakes, and bees or wasps. So always keep an eye on that in your children garden areas. Digging areas, like I mentioned before, fantastic. Miniature-sized furniture. We always keep chairs for our littles outside. They have their own set of tools. Those are all very good things to keep in the gardens for them. Art, pinwheels, garden flags. They love anything like that. It draws their attention and keeps them entertained. Also, if you have extra seeds that you're not worried about after you're done planting, let them plant it in their garden and see how much success they have. Don't be afraid if you've overplanted. They will help you pull weeds. Sometimes it's difficult to keep them engaged in what is a weed and what is something that you're actually planning to keep in your vegetable garden, but that's part of the process and they'll get it over time. There's also a ton of ideas online, as you see in the middle picture here. It looks like Erin's got a TP or trellis activity started. You can actually do garden houses with the little ones, where those will grow up usually with vining plants such as beans. Sometimes you can use squash. There's a variety of different things that will go up, and those make like a little interior room that the kids can use to play in. So those are all really fun ideas to use with your kids. So don't hesitate to incorporate them in.
Hey, Maxine, I was just going to say, you know, we talk about this is for children's gardens, but, you know, honestly, most of this stuff I would put in my own garden even if I didn't have kids.
Yeah.
So like the chalkboard, a lot of times I'll use it and I'll put welcome messages if I have guests coming over. Or the mailbox, that's where I tend to stick my gloves and my pruning shears because I can't seem to not lose them. So if I put them there, I know where they are usually. So, you know, it is fun for adults too. I'll hide in we do a corn maze or some kind of house. I'll go out there and hide from the kids. So, you know, you don't have to be a child to have this in your garden for sure. I think it just adds some whimsy to it. You might have a dinosaur garden in your vegetable garden, for instance. It just adds whimsy and it's fun. So.
Yep. Lots of fun to incorporate garden characters too. So, whether it be your garden gnomes or Bigfoot. I know one of my colleagues has Bigfoot in her gardens. Lots of fun there. So don't hesitate to be creative. Okay, next, thinking about budget, especially in times like these where everything's kind of been turned upside down. What are some of the cheapest ways that you can get going with your garden, and what are some reasonable costs that you can expect? First of all, here in Florida, I will tell you, in my opinion, soil is probably your biggest expense. So getting started, if you have poor soils, can be a little costly, because if you have poor soils, you've either got to do a lot of amendments or get your fertilizer right from the get-go. Container gardens is one of the best mechanisms out there, but I can tell you, if you're like my husband, he likes to use the Fox Farm soils, and they're about $20 a bag. So he can only do so many containers with that before it gets really expensive, and he likes to change it out every season. We have had excellent success with that, but again, the upfront cost is significant there. Raised beds. First of all, Erin already talked about using 2x6s or cedar. You don't want to use railroad ties. So what materials you're starting to build your structure with is going to affect your cost. One of my favorite things to build raised beds at, and it's a little bit less expensive in my opinion as well, is cinder blocks, cement blocks. That's what I use with my kids for our raised beds. First of all, they can go outside and they can decorate those with chalk. So it's really fun there, and they can do that after every time it rains. It washes it clean and they can go again. Secondly, my kids can paint pictures on the side, or they can plant flowers in the tops of the cinder blocks, and those can be moved and reused as we change soil or have to till. So I like using those materials. Others depend on the type of wood you're going to use, the size of wood. So whether you're doing 6-inch deep beds, or if you're going to do 10 or 12-inch beds, as the thickness goes up or the height goes up, that cost is going to increase with the wood products. So as is the depth of the soil, which also increase cost. Grow buckets can be very economical. You can usually buy a 5-gallon bucket for about $3. We might even have some laying around. Between that and the pipe and the soil, you're usually looking at less than $10 to do a grow bucket. So those are excellent options. Tomatoes and peppers do really well in those. Lots of different opportunities there, and it's just a different type of container, really. Traditional gardening depends on the size and is the soil amendments, fertilizers, and seeds that are going to be needed. So it's much harder to predict a traditional garden just because there's so much variation. I know for us, we started out with a garden that was roughly 20 foot by 60 foot long. That was my husband's idea. It wasn't extremely costly because we were using animal manures out of our farm to amend the soils with it. But I will tell you that the weed seeds got where they were uncontrollable, so we went to a raised bed anyway. So even though the upfront cost was more, our production has been better. Hydroponic towers are a little bit more costly, but you don't have the issues with weeds. You don't have the issues with guesstimating what your soil pH is, or trying to figure out what amendments to use. It's usually a very specific formulation. Most of these systems come with clear instructions, and those systems start around $150. And I know one of the systems that we use is Vertigrow. So those towers are a ready set package, and like I said, about $135 to $150 will get you a couple towers to get started with. There's a variety of different things you can grow in hydroponic towers, so you're not limited there. Your herbs will do fantastic in those. Peppers, your smaller tomatoes, like your cherry tomatoes, will do well. They just take up a lot of space, so if you only have a couple towers, it does limit what else you can grow because of the amount of space they take up. So, and we kind of already hit on containers, so I'm going to skip that. Erin, if you'll go to the next.
Maxine, we do have a question on, do we know of sources for loose loads of soil suitable for vegetable gardening? And I would say it depends on where you are in the state. We can give you those local sources. Typically, at least from my experience, it's been at your local landscape type store where you can buy in bulk. Normally it's some kind of compost mix is what you're looking for. If you're in or near a zoo, like Jacksonville Zoo, for instance, does do Zoo-Doo, that's free, and that is certified compost. You can get manure as well if you're willing to compost it, but in bulk, usually it's from those landscape type local sources or stores. So if you're in this area, we usually go to Evachex or Nobles. If you're in Jacksonville, it'd be like Mulch Masters. You know, if you're down in Marion County, it'd be a different location. So it just depends on where you are. I would recommend possibly calling your extension office and then asking. So I see, Dawn, you're in Columbia. So most everybody here goes to some place called Evachex, which is off of 41. That's really the only place we found. Normally I'd give you the list, but if anybody knows any place else, you certainly can chime in.
Yeah, and for those of you in Marion County, depending on how much you need, we've actually been getting in soils from the Apopka area from a company called Southeast Soils, but they only deliver like dump truck loads. We also have the dirt pile and several other composting facilities near us. I will tell you there's several horse farms that are doing composting. Some of them are certified organic, but beware, there may be issues with herbicides. So always ask questions about the source of the compost. So I've heard really mixed reviews on some of those. Some of them have had fantastic luck. They swear by it, say it's the greatest soil they've ever used. And I've had others say they can't grow anything in them. And again, you always run the risk when you're working with animal manures of past herbicide usage. Even if it wasn't used on the farm where the animals were at, it can come in and go through their digestive system in the hays that they're eating or other feed sources.
Right. So we had that problem again, like at the zoo in Jacksonville, and that's why they certify test theirs, because it was that problem exactly. And it has to sit for so long before that half-life is gone. Somebody asked about mushroom compost, and so Maxine and I had actually talked about this earlier. It's very popular. You can buy it in bulk usually, especially up here. We buy in bulk. We've been testing the mushroom compost that we're getting here locally, and it was a fairly high pH. But what we recommend is taking that mushroom compost and mixing it with another compost, like a potting soil type compost mix, and then you're getting that appropriate pH level.
Yep. Yep. And along with that, guys, if you're looking to buy any kind of large quantities, ask them what the soil pH is before you purchase it. I know I have had some people come to me and think they have the greatest source of compost ever, and we've tested it, and it's been 7.8 or 7.9 soil pH, and you're not going to grow much for vegetables in that. You're going to really struggle. So, and speaking of that, our soil lab is still open at the Marion County Extension Office. However, our office is not open to the public. So if you have soil samples that you're wanting to bring in, please call ahead and we can put out a drop box for you. And we're still doing soil samples every other week. So if you need your soil tested, don't hesitate to bring it in. Just give us a heads up and you can drop it off outside the front door and we'll get it tested on our regular every other Thursday schedule. So
I can tell you in Columbia, we're not currently testing. My volunteers can't come in to do that. But we are going to show you, hopefully next week, we'll be doing some pH testing with cabbage. So it's actually pretty accurate. Gives you a good idea anyway. So we'll show you how to do that, and that'll be a video that we post on our Facebook page for Columbia County, so you can check that out.
Y'all go play, please. Okay, guys, sorry about that. I knew my 3-year-old couldn't stay out of the picture long enough. Sorry. So when we're talking about planning for cost, plan for the extras. Are you going to need trellises? Are you doing indeterminate tomatoes? Are you doing beans, squash, other sources that are going to need support? Trellises are really important to support the structure of your plant. If they stay on the ground when they need to be trellised, you're probably going to end up with disease or pest problems. You may also end up with rotting fruit. All of these are not going to be productive to get those into your kitchen at the end of the day. So yes, there can be extra costs associated with it. Some of the designs you'll see here are cattle panels. That's what we happen to be using in our gardens. You can, of course, buy smaller tomato cages. I will say the tomato cages can be difficult as far as you'll get a lot of decreased airflow inside. It gets really dense inside the tomato cage, and then you might try to work it around it, and oftentimes will end up breaking limbs. So you've got to be really careful and treat these plants with a little bit of delicate, tender touch. So there's lots of other ways to do trellising if needed. You can use wires, you can use poles. Again, how creative are you? What other structures do you have around that you can possibly use? Cattle panels are about $16 to $20 a piece depending on the gauge and the size of it, but they're very effective in trellising up many things, and you can make some designs with them, so it doesn't have to be so basic. It really depends on what your needs are.
Yeah, I will tell you, this is probably one of the areas I struggle with. I don't like putting, one, I feel like I'm not creative, so I have to use Pinterest. And then two, I don't like putting a lot of money into it, but then I struggle at the end, like Maxine says, that half my stuff doesn't do well because it doesn't trellis correctly. This year, again, we're stuck at home, and I have hula hoops all over the house. We used hula hoops as our trellises, so that's the bottom base, and then the string goes up to a pole at the top for our beans right now. So that's kind of what we're using and getting creative. So, you know, look around the yard and see what you have. We had a hard time finding twine, to be honest, though, over at, I think we were at Lowe's or Home Depot, and we couldn't find twine. So I think everybody's doing the same thing at this point. We did have a question going back to the soil real quick, and this one's an easy one, Maxine. So they're just starting out. How about bag soils from someplace like Lowe's or Home Depot for raised beds? Yeah, absolutely. And you can see, now keep in mind, there'll be a couple different choices there. You might see some that are specifically for raised beds. Check to see if it has fertilizer in it. So a lot of these now come with like moisture retaining particles in it that'll hold moisture more, or you might see the fertilizer in it. So if you do see that, you know, you need to adjust your fertilizer on the other end, but just make sure you know what you're purchasing. But yeah, those work fine. Those work good.
Yep. So, and I've tried a ton of varieties of soil. Prior to becoming an extension agent, I worked with the Farm to School program up in Northeast District, which is actually how I started working with Erin a decade ago. And we often bought bagged soils for the teachers because it was so much easier for them to handle. And oftentimes we buy whatever they had available in bulk. So we used everything from Black Cow to Miracle Grow. But always make sure you get the garden soil, not the topsoil. So, and then like I said, we had other projects where we would use some of the more expensive stuff. So I've had good luck with Jungle Growth on occasion. Fox Farm has been excellent, but it's about 4 times the cost, 3 to 4 times the cost. So just definitely look at the ingredients on the bag and read it thoroughly before you pick just the cheaper brands. Their cheaper brands are sometimes fantastic, but just know what you're going to need to add to it as far as fertilizers go. So thanks, Erin. Okay, so where do you put your raised bed or your containers or your traditional garden? Where do you want it located? First and foremost, where is your water access? As Erin spoke about earlier, I won't go too far into depth in that, but if you don't have a good accessible water source, you're going to have major issues, because just like we finally got some rain last night, it's been at least a month and a half since we've had rain. So you just have very unpredictable weather. And for those of you that are not from Florida, this is very normal here. So we'll go for weeks getting rain every day, and then we'll go for 2 months without having a single wet day. So water access is very important. Also, unless you're planning to grow things that will do okay with limited sunlight, most of our fruits and vegetables need 6 to 8 hours a day of sunlight. And morning sun is usually the best. That afternoon sun can get really hot. So I actually have my raised bed outside in a spot where it really gets too much sun. But most of the time, as long as you're getting at least 6 hours of sunlight, your vegetable garden will be good. If you are in a spot that's super hot like mine is, again, that goes back to that water point. As long as we keep water accessible to the garden, the plants do fine. But if we skip an afternoon of watering, we may be in trouble. So it'll really stress the plants. Soil quality. If you're going to have it in a location that's less than optimal, soil quality can help reduce the stress. If you've got too much sunlight or not enough water, if you've got a better soil quality, it will have a better water holding capacity and also support the root system. So I can't say enough about having good soil. However, most of you, if you're planning to do traditional in-ground gardens, you're already familiar with the fact that we have a lot of sand here in Florida. So just be aware that you're probably going to have to amend that soil, and you can do that by adding compost. Pine bark helps. If it's small pine bark, you don't want to add large chunks of pine bark. But pine bark really can add a significant tool. And you can use a variety of different mixtures, including if you're in containers, you might be doing a mixture of compost with topsoil or sand and vermiculite. Usually those are a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, but it really depends on what you're planning and what the container or what the location is. So I'm actually going to put an attachment that we'll send out by email as well, but I've just added it into our chat box. There's a whole list of soil mixtures and how to properly get them prepared in the chat box. There's a link there for you. But soil is basically the bottom line, because that's what supports your root system. Proximity to tools. I know here at my place we have a big shed in the back, and it is a long ways from the garden, which means I often have to pick my husband's tools up, because where he uses them is where they lay. I know in our community gardens we specifically made sure that we had a tool shed that was close enough to the gardens where kids would put them back appropriately. The different adults that would come in on the weekends would also have their own stations and would put them back. It's really important to make sure that tools are A, put up and kept taken care of, and B, cleaned. So you don't want to have things laying around in the dirt. A, somebody could trip and fall on it and get hurt, but B, they get rusty and dirty, and that's not good. Proximity to animals and livestock. Depending on where you're at, you may have a variety of issues with animals. Personally, I have horses, so if I turn my horse loose to graze in our yard, the first thing she normally goes for is my vegetable garden. Does not go over well. So consider electric fences. Consider other physical methods to keep them out of your garden. You may also have issues with wildlife such as deer. My husband was talking about planting a row of corn this year, which I think would be fantastic. And it will grow here, but every time it gets just about ready to harvest, the deer usually mow it right to the ground. So know what's around you as far as your animals go. Also, if you have neighbors that let cats or dogs loose, realize that often the vegetable garden becomes a great place for them to want to use the bathroom, which can cause hazards to you, protozoas, other bacterial issues. So hopefully that's not an issue for you, but I do want to mention it because I have seen that become a problem. Feral cats can be a big issue in the gardens. So lastly, don't forget about your pollinators. That's a call I get frequently at our office. People growing squash or other vegetables that are not getting pollinated appropriately, and then their flowers rot and fall off, and they want to know why. So don't hesitate to plant nice flowers around your vegetable garden, or this is another way that the foodscaping really comes into play in my personal opinion. I love to do the foodscaping, and I love to have the flowers around the vegetable garden because it can really attract good pollinators that will keep your fruit production at an optimum level.
I was going to mention too, with the animals and livestock, if you're looking into something like permaculture, or if you're in an urban area where maybe you're doing the urban chicken thing, keep in mind that your chickens are not the best thing to have in and or very close to your garden, okay?
Right.
Just because if you do have water that washes, or again, you mentioned the protozoas, E. coli, things like that, you want to make sure that you're washing the vegetables if they are nearby. But we do see that sometimes that really we don't want the chickens mixing too much with your vegetables. So,
and if you're going to use chicken manure or rabbit manure or horse manure or cow manure or any other manure, just make sure it's composted for a long enough period that it is not a raw form. It's important to get those up to the correct temperatures. We normally recommend a temperature of 130 degrees to get your compost up to, but it's also the length of time too. So never recommend using raw manure in your gardens, just because there are some significant food safety risks associated with that. But I will tell you, they're phenomenal sources of nitrogen and also some carbon sources as well that will help build your soils, but they really need to be composted first. You cannot just incorporate them in raw.
So we do have some composting questions since you're talking about that, Maxine.
Okay.
First question is, what's your opinion on using oak leaves for compost? All the trees are dropping, obviously, right now.
So thankfully I have tons and tons and tons of oak trees at my house. Overall, the oak leaves do just fine, but they do take quite a while to compost, and they can be acidic. So you've got to be kind of careful with that and make sure they don't smother out whatever you're growing. I personally like to mow mine over and kind of chop them up into a mulch, or put them into a trimmer where they get chopped up finely, and that'll help them break down. But they do add a nice component to the soil, and like I said, they can be very good additions to a compost or mulch pile in the long run. But unfortunately, there's so many of them, they can kind of be the main component if you're not being careful to have them broken down properly.
Yeah, I would agree that I shred mine as well.
Yeah.
We had somebody else said that they had added shredded magnolia leaves about 2 years ago as mulch, found out later it inhibited plant growth. They said that's what happened. Can it be fixed, or can it correct itself by now? I'm not familiar if magnolias are we call it allelopathic. Have you heard anything about magnolias?
I have not heard that one in the past. So I know there are definitely certain plants out there that can be. But I would think as it breaks down, it's going to reduce its effect over time. So hopefully you could be in better shape now, but it will take some time for that to wear off if they are truly allelopathic.
Yeah, I would add some other organic matter in there.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody asked, rabbit okay? I don't compost my rabbit manure as long as, say, horse manure. It's not considered as hot. And then what about goat pellets, they said?
I think goat pellets are fine. They're, usually as long as the animal is not a meat eater, we recommend using it. But again, I'd still recommend using it as composted version, not just raw. So, and same with the rabbit manure. I know some people do use it raw, but we like to compost it for short periods of time if possible. So.
And maple leaves, I compost maple leaves. So again, we'll have to look into the magnolia. Somebody uses emu poop. I guess if you had it, you could just compost it.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think, any of the above is fine. Just make sure that you compost it for a significant time.
Right.
Okay, so moving on. What do you want to plant in your garden? So we talked a little bit about this already, and I won't take too much time on this, but there's a variety of vegetables, but it's important too. You can incorporate herbs and flowers. Like I said, don't forget about those pollinators. And, you know, if you've got kids or grandkids, it's really fun to incorporate some of the herbs too, that they can, get some of the different senses going. So whether it be rosemary or basil, and then you can also use those in cooking too. So I know with my kids, I love to do the pizza gardens, and we often do those with the school gardens as well. So flowers add not only an aesthetic appeal, but they do also attract the pollinators. So lots of good things there. And of course, there's some flowers that can help repel pests, such as your marigolds. They're not an end-all be-all solution, but they're not bad to have in the garden either. We'll talk a little bit more later about some other options with flowers. I know Erin's going to talk about trap crops, so we won't go too much into that yet. What should you grow? So in my opinion, this is the most fun of the garden, is deciding what to grow and picking out your seeds. I personally am a major seed fan, so I love to use open pollinated seeds. I love to use new varieties. Look at the area that you're in. I know, like I said, I mentioned earlier, my garden happens to be in an extremely hot area, but what other heat restrictions do you have? What is your USDA growing zone? For those of us in Marion County, most of us are in zone 9A. But what other restrictions might you have? Are you getting a significant cold area in the fall? Right now, with summertime coming, summer is our hardest season to grow in. So if you're just now getting ready to plant, you're going to want to make sure that you have heat tolerant varieties. Using organic, heirloom versus conventional or hybrid seeds is really important. And then also the harvest time. With the heirloom and organic seeds, sometimes you have a longer harvest time than some of the hybrids, and that can also leave you open to having more pest and disease problems. So I know from my garden and my past experiences, I like varieties that have shorter harvest times on them. So if there's a variety out there that has a 50-day harvest time versus a 75-day harvest time, I'm probably going to go for that. Where do you get them from? We have lots of different seed companies out there. I know Erin and I both use Johnny Seeds. I like rareseeds.com. Actually, I think it's rareseeds.org. But that's Baker Heirlooms. There are so many different seed companies out there. You can, of course, get them locally as well at your hardware stores, Lowe's and Home Depot. Oftentimes, you'll find burpee seeds and transplants as well. So transplants can give you a distinct advantage in that they're already started, so your season gets going a little faster. You'll also get production faster, but you don't get the choices in variety. So, and that's the fun of having seeds. So I know some of my colleagues will plant, you know, I actually have one colleague that I know of that plants 130 different varieties of tomatoes each year. There's so many varieties out there, and they're coming out with new stuff every year. Tomatoes are really one of my favorite passions, and so the new varieties of tomatoes give me a lot of interest. My husband loves to do peppers, so he's got about 25 different varieties of peppers growing right now. There's just so many different things that you can do with that. So generally when you're talking transplants, you're going to go back and forth with the same varieties at each different store. So there's not a lot of selection there. Soil mixes for your gardens. Optimum soil pH for your vegetable gardens really about 6.2 to 6.5. If you don't know what your soil pH is, again, don't hesitate to call us and drop off a soil sample. We'll be happy to get that tested for you. The UF Soils Lab is still open as well, so you can ship that directly to them, and they will also give you a nutrient analysis. I do recommend this if you're doing in-ground gardening, because it's nice to know where you're at and have a bottom line. We don't have the technology to do that in our offices. We can only do the soil pH. Organic matter versus sand. We have a lot of sand naturally, so if you're doing in-ground gardening, you're probably going to have to add some amendments to it. We already hit the compost issue, so on the right-hand side here, you'll see a table of carbon and nitrogen values. So these are all different things that you can add into your compost, including coffee grounds, grass clippings, manure, bark, wood chips, and even the leaves. So it's really important to know what that carbon and nitrogen ratio is, though, as you're mixing them in. So, and we'll kind of skip through that to save on some time. But if you guys have further questions on composting, don't hesitate to reach out to us later.
Somebody asked what the pH of black cow is. I honestly, I don't know. I haven't tested it recently.
Yeah. And I know too, they use a variety of different sources of where they get it from. So it could vary somewhat depending on when they're, harvesting their product as well. So, okay. Dealing with problems. So on the right-hand side here, we've got a group of aphids on hot peppers. This was an issue that I dealt with earlier in the spring this year. Pest problems are definitely going to occur. Most of them can be resolved using a horticultural oil or soap spray. I will say as we move into the summer months, the horticultural oil becomes almost unusable because you've got the risk of being burning your crops. So you've got to be very careful with that. There are other options, but we try to stick with the safest options out there, and usually our soap and oils are going to be those most effective and well-rounded for use. Other issues, if you burn your soils with too much fertilizer, you're going to have things that are too hot, and this will cause wilting and also some issues with your leaves that look similar to diseases sometimes. So be careful not to use products around your garden, and also use limited fertilizer as needed. So some people really like to side dress their gardens as they're planting. Other people would prefer to wait at least 2 or 3 weeks to give those transplants time to start. But especially as your plants are young, it's really important to go easy on the fertilizer. I'm not a big fan of 10-10-10. I like some of the lesser fertilizers because they're a little safer to prevent that burning. We've talked a lot about soils already, so I won't go into that too much, but poor soils is something that needs to be addressed from day one. You can't grow a good garden with poor soils without the proper amendments. So unwanted animals is something that we all deal with, so don't feel like you're on your own, whether it be an armadillo digging up your garden, raccoon, or squirrels coming and helping you with your harvest. My old philosophy is, one, wildlife has been here for a long time, and it's probably going to be here for a lot longer if we have a healthy environment. So plant one for you and one for them. You have to be somewhat tolerant of it and also be creative in your thought processes on getting rid of them. I will say using simple things like going to the dollar store and getting a ground red pepper or ground cayenne pepper that you sprinkle around your gardens can help. Other people say garlic will help, but something that makes it less appealing. I've heard people using human hair. That's not personally something I'm a fan of, but you do have to get creative to sometimes deter the wildlife and pests that will get into your gardens. Other issues with pests and diseases, you're welcome to email us issues, and we'll be happy to help diagnose those.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you this photo here. This is a friend of mine, and keep in mind this is in out west, but I wanted to show you, you can see her deer fence that she's got here. So see how tall that is? I know I've had some people ask recently about how to keep critters out. That would be one option, of course. And then you can also see that she's put up a little bit of shade cloth. You don't see this a whole lot in Florida where we are shading our gardens. I have the same problem that Maxine does. My garden is on the west side of my house, not on the east side where I would prefer to have it. And I actually have better soil moisture on the east side of my house, but all of my neighbors can see it. And at the end of the season, my garden does not look good, so I didn't want to put it there. So I actually chose to put it on the other side of the house. So I do have some heat issues as well. But this is an option if you get really, really hot, you could shade it. This is shade cloth, and you can get shade cloth in varying rates. So typically if it's a 30% or less shade cloth, it's letting quite a bit of light through. So now we're going to kind of wrap up and talk about the planning process and kind of how you go through this. Again, I hope you're thinking about if you haven't already started your garden or have a garden, what do you want it to look like, and what do you want to do, raised beds or containers or plots? So I'm going to show you what I do and kind of walk you through my garden that I do every year. So you want to start with a blank piece of paper, and this one actually came out of, I'll show you in just a second, it's a guide out of North Dakota State University. It's a gardening journal. So they have a nice little grid pattern where you can kind of plot it out. But you kind of have to decide, what am I going to plant this year, or what do I want to have in my garden? So I will show you, this happens to be my list of what I currently have at my house. Okay, so you can see I have a whole bunch of stuff. And the reason I have a whole bunch of stuff is really because we can't sell with our Master Gardener sale right now. So a lot of it's at my house. The top pictures here were from my winter garden. So I like color. I think I mentioned that already. This is the graffiti cauliflower, the Vita Verde cauliflower, and then Alabama blue collards. So I like things with texture. Honestly, very few people in my house eat cauliflower, and nobody eats collards, but they're pretty, and my neighbors really enjoy them. So again, we garden because it's fun. So the problem I have is there is a whole bunch on my list, as you can see. And so I need to think about if I really am going to plant all of these things, what's it going to look like? I can't just go out there and randomly put things in the ground because I could really mess myself up. One, my trellising is not right. Two, my watering's off. I'll mention companion planting in a minute. Some things don't like to be next to each other. My squash could easily eat my peppers, okay? Meaning they're going to take them over. So I have to kind of plan out, where am I going to put this stuff? Okay, so I have several tomatoes I want to use. I have some cucumbers. I do have some field corn that came up in my compost pile. So just for fun, we're going to take it out of the compost pile and see if we can put it in the ground and see what happens. Okay. All right, so I draw a picture, and this is my non-traditional design. Again, I can't garden in a row. I have a real problem with it. I just can't do it. So this is what we plan on kind of doing this year. Some of this has already been planted. We do have a center area here, and you'll notice I have basil in here with my flowers. Okay, so I do add a little bit of herbs, but I've got potatoes over here. They are already in the ground. You need to put your potatoes in usually in January or February. So those are in the ground. The kids planted those. But notice they're not next to my tomatoes, excuse me, or my corn. And there's a reason I did that. I also made sure that my pumpkins and watermelons were over here, okay, along with my taller stuff. My tomatoes and peppers are down here, and I've got some squash. Now I do try and, the sun comes up over on the right side and then it goes down on the west side. So this side tends to get a lot of sun, okay. You can see this would be difficult to irrigate though, or could be, okay. So I do struggle with that because it's kind of so random. And then I also, you know, I'm not one that goes by the planting recommendations necessarily. I should, you know, do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. So I may put plants closer together. I tend to do more square foot type gardening where it's a smaller space and I put a lot more in it. But these are pretty wide, so it is difficult to get in here, I will be honest, okay? So you can see all the things I put in here, and I do kind of in my head map out, all right, I think I want to put pumpkins here. I want to put tomatoes over here, and I'm going to need trellises for these. And how many can I put in? I always have more plants than I need. That's just the way it is. You know, I probably will only be able to get 4 or 5 tomatoes in here, okay? But you'll see in a minute, you know, I'll just have extra. Now, one thing you could do, this is my traditional rows. This is what we did this winter, and I didn't enjoy it, but it was a brand new garden to us. I just started it. So you can see where I kind of put out what I did. And again, I'll never do that again. There's nothing wrong with it. I just didn't like it. So, but I do plan it out. So I wanted my carrots on the outside because I didn't want something like my cauliflower blocking my carrots with the sun. So I think about how tall is stuff going to get? Is it going to block everything else? Okay. So this is what I aspire to look like. This is Longwood Gardens. I used to work there many years ago. This is in Pennsylvania. But this is where I come from. It's beautiful. Yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. They incorporate a lot of color into their gardens. And there are traditional rows, which is nice. You know, their rows are very wide. They have a lot of space, though, that they're working with. My garden's like this big, you know, very small, maybe 3 or 4 of those rows. And so, I'm not out there weeding every day, but I want it to be pretty. So I do add a lot of flowers and a lot of color in there. So let's talk about some of these other things, and I'll get to Diane's question in a minute, but I want to talk about companion planting and some of the things that we need to think about. So companion planting is this idea of plants that do well together, okay? And so, for instance, we look at things that have nitrogen fixation, legumes, so your beans and your peas do a really good job of this. And they actually will fix nitrogen for themselves, but keep in mind, you have to have the bacteria, the microbes, to fix it for other plants. Okay, so a lot of people say, oh, you can plant them together and they'll have nitrogen, you don't have to add fertilizer. But if you have poor soils like I do, there's probably not enough microbes there to convert that for other plants. So I'm working on adding that organic matter into my garden so that this will work for me. The mutual climate cooperation is something else that's you can consider, especially if you have a hot garden. And what I mean is I was talking about shading out other plants. Well, corn can handle quite a bit of light, and they like intense light. So I could plant corn on that edge or every couple rows, and that way it's blocking in the afternoon. It's not blocking the morning sun for my veggies, but it's blocking that intense afternoon heat for some of my other vegetables that maybe won't take as much or will wilt faster. So that's a really good thing to think about. But again, you have to think about it before you even start. And then trap crops is something else that work really, really well. And a trap crop is you plant a plant specifically because you know it's going to attract insects. So I use sunflowers. They're yellow, they do attract insects. Curled mustard is another one that we know will attract a lot of our beetles out there, your flea beetles that will get the little holes in things like potatoes. So if you plant mustard, they tend to attract those insects to that plant. Now my intent is not necessarily to eat the mustard. I might get a little bit, but it's really to trap or attract those insects away from my vegetables to that crop. So you can consider doing some trap crops. They're also known as banker crops or banker plants. So if you're doing a little research, you might use either one of those terms. Something else to consider is doing something like Three Sisters. And so you may have heard of this. This is where you're using kind of your vegetables to your advantage, if you will. So Three Sisters is that corn and the beans and the squash planted together. Traditionally, it's on a mound. So you're planting it on a mound. You put the corn in first. You wait till it gets about 3-4 inches tall. Then you would plant your beans, and they're usually right around the corn. And those beans are then going to use the corn as a trellis. The beans are fixing nitrogen, which the corn requires a lot of. And then you would plant your squash on the outside of the bean area. And that squash typically has large leaves, which then shades the ground. It helps with moisture retention and kind of cooling effect. So that's the Three Sisters, and those are great companion plants that you can plant together. The other thing that you have to consider is crop rotation. So you'll notice, and I'll show you again in a minute, where I put my tomatoes this year is not necessarily where I'm going to put my tomatoes next year. I want to rotate them because I probably will have a lot of nematodes. Again, I have poor soil, not a lot of organic matter yet. And so things like nematodes, which are those microscopic worms that tend to attack the roots and can lower productivity, they can build up in one area. They like certain crops. I can rotate these crops, and now I'm reducing that pest pressure or that disease pressure even on those crops. Now, I wouldn't want to take typically my tomatoes and then plant potatoes afterwards because they do tend to get the same diseases. Somebody had asked, is there a chart when to plant different veggies? See, Maxine put that there. Another great chart I would recommend you guys look up, and we will try and add this to the email we send out to you guys, but it's companion plants. And so this one's based on North Dakota State again, and actually Burpee uses this as well. So this one came from Burpee's website from North Dakota Extension. But it's taking the plant, and I kind of picked what we're growing right now. So beans, carrots, corn, tomatoes, and the companions you would want to plant with that. So if you have a bean, you're putting in beans, things like carrots, corns, cucumbers are all great. The allies are ones that can help them, and then the enemies are things you don't want to plant with them. So for instance, garlic and onions will stunt the growth of your beans. Okay, so you don't want to put them in the same bed together. You're not going to have great success there. Look at the tomatoes and the corn. Okay, corn, something they recommend is not putting your tomatoes and corn together. Why is that? It's not that they're necessarily, you know, going to hurt each other through chemical like allelopathy, but they tend to get the same insects. Okay, so they're attracting the same kind of insects, same kind of caterpillars normally. Tomatoes and potatoes, for instance, tend to get blight, and they both can get the same kind of blight, which will wipe out your crop. Trust me. If you start getting blight through your tomatoes, typically it's rip everything out. Okay, so you don't want to put them in the same area right next to each other because you might see crossover. And a lot of times it's either through wind, water, or even the gardener itself, you're moving those kind of diseases because you've touched one plant and then you turn around and touch another plant. So this is a very short list, okay? But I do encourage you to go and look this up and do a little bit more exploration. I find it extremely fascinating what we can and can't plant together. Things like the dill, okay, chives, garlic came up a lot. As far as what will retard growth or inhibit growth. A lot of our herbs are plant allies, meaning they're going to help the plants, and that may be from just attracting, or they tend to be very fragrant. So this is really, really interesting stuff, or at least I think it is, and certainly worth looking at more as you kind of choose what you're going to plant, but more specifically, where you're going to plant it, okay? And then some tips and tricks. One thing I like to do, and I've been playing with the last couple of years, is using intercropping. And so you can use cover crops, which is between growing seasons usually, where once your garden's done, we cover crop with maybe soybeans. You might use clover in the winter. You let it grow, and then you would till it back in, okay? And this just helps increase the nutrients and that sort of thing. But I've been using intercropping, and what that means is I hate to weed, okay? And so intercropping is taking the shorter vegetables and actually growing them between your other vegetables, your tomatoes and things like that. So for winter, I typically put in clover, and so it's a nice red clover that will bloom, attracts lots of pollinators. You know, it gets probably 6 inches or so. So one winter, I will tell you, it wasn't cold enough, and my collard and things were really, really slow. So my cabbage plants, my collards, they should have grown faster than the clovers, but that didn't necessarily happen. So I did have to go kind of rescue them a little bit and get the clover off of them to get some sunlight to them. But I didn't weed at all, okay? I didn't have to weed. And a lot of these are nitrogen fixing, which does help. So this year I'll probably try beans in some areas, the bush beans, or I might try like a cowpea. It's a little bit harder to find stuff for the summer, I'll be honest, for intercropping, because a lot of it's tall, so you want something short. But it's an interesting method, and especially if you're somebody that like me doesn't like to weed, it's been working really well for us. And I can improve my soil because I just till it back in at the end, okay? Again, some other tips and tricks: make sure you're using those banker plants to attract insects. I can't tell you how well they work. You can also use those, Maxine mentioned planting for your other animals. This one happens to be my personal bunny rabbit, but we do have bunnies that live where we do. So he really likes the garden, but I was going more for the compost on this one, of using, you know, this is our carrots we grew, feeding the tops to him and then using his compost. But you certainly could be attracting other animals as well. Consider something like succession planting. And what I mean by succession planting is if you decide to do seeds, you might do on week 1, you might plant some bean seeds. Leave an area in your garden or in your raised bed or whatever you're going to do for week 2 or 3 to come back and plant some more. That way you're extending your season a little bit. And if something happens to the plants in week 1, for instance, you still have a backup. But it really extends your season a little bit longer, and then you're not stuck with 5-10 pounds of beans that you're harvesting all at once, whereas you might have 2 people in the house and you really wanted it for a lot longer. So kind of if you put a little bit in the ground at a time, carrots work really well for this as well, because carrots is a fairly long crop depending what size you're growing, but you can plant them throughout the season and have carrots for a very, very long time. Okay. Other tips and tricks: make sure you're adding flowers to the garden, art as well. Again, I think that's just fun. Flowers for the pollinators is very important. And then that composting piece, which we've talked fairly extensively about, but I know from feedback from a lot of people, unless you're doing raised beds where you're bringing in the soil and you're starting with something good, or containers, if you're doing in-ground, you're probably like the majority of us, where we're dealing with very sandy, extremely low organic matter. The pH may be where we want it, but most likely not. But composting is going to be one of those ways where you can really add in the biggest bang for your buck. And plus you're just responsibly using what's on the property. So that being said, and kind of looking at some of our ideas of companion planting and whatnot, should I redesign my garden? I went back and said, okay, do I need to change some things? So some things that I might consider changing, or I want to point out, when I went back and said, okay, are my potatoes and my tomatoes, do I have them in the same spot? Well, luckily they're separated a little bit. Okay, I wanted to put some over here too, but I'm not planning on putting any in the upper plot area. Okay, and these rows are probably, these walkways are 4 feet across, give or take. But you'll notice that I do split up my tomatoes, and the reason I do that, I try and do that every year, because if I do get something like the virus, or I might get blight through, a lot of times I'll get it in one area but not the other side, and so it helps protect some of those plants. Plus my pests won't find, they're less likely to find all of them at once. But I do want to consider, we didn't mention, but sometimes your squash or your cucumbers, they might be a boy plant or a girl plant. So meaning they need to be near each other, like corn. I can't put corn too far apart, otherwise it's not going to get pollinated. So knowing that, I don't want to put them too far apart. Cucumbers are the same way. I happen to buy seed that didn't need, that could self-pollinate. So my squash is the same thing, but I knew that when I was planting. Okay. So the other option I could do some Three Sisters here up in this left-hand corner where the field corn is. That might be kind of fun. And then I might add some corn or sunflowers or something taller on the left-hand side by the tomatoes where it gets so hot. Also, if you noticed on the chart, it said that tomatoes and basil do really, really well together. And again, I like to, oh, my lights just shut off. I like to intercrop. So, maybe herbs might be what I intercrop with this year. And that way, I can still utilize it, but they do well. So trying some of that basil, oregano, things like that, parsley, as my intercrop instead of something like a bean would be a good choice. So I want to talk about what's next, and we're kind of wrapping up here. But you need to find your seeds, your plants if you haven't already. I think a lot of people have started theirs. They started them indoors. It's kind of just, we're in that getting ready to plant phase. But make sure you're thinking about your design before you stick them in the ground, because you can, again, run into some problems. We can recommend keeping a garden journal. And this is one, this is where I took those pages out of. So this is, again, from North Dakota State. And they have a little garden journal. You're just writing down things that worked for you. Maybe when did you plant? I had some Jedi jalapeno peppers that I started this year. When did I start them? Did they do well? Do I want to buy them next year? Where did I get them from? Because if you're like me, I tend to lose the little packages that come in, so I can never keep them straight. And so this is where all of your stuff would be in one place. Don't forget about your fertilizer and your irrigation, okay? Fertilizer is key if you actually want your plants to grow, and so is the irrigation, okay? We do want you guys to keep in touch, and so we'll show you how to do that in just a second. And then consider future seasons. So, you know, my favorite time for gardening is really the fall garden. Again, I don't eat most of it, but my plants do really well. So think about your future seasons, okay? You know, if your goal is to have your garden go all the way through summer, which is very difficult here, okay? What can you grow? Maybe you're leaning more towards like a pumpkin or something that has a very long growing season versus something that has a short season because you want to have something in the ground the entire time. So keep in mind, and then I don't know if Maxine mentioned it, but like tomato plants, if you are using heirloom tomatoes, some of those do have heat restrictions on them, meaning they won't set fruit at a certain temperature. So if it gets too hot, you know, and it's 89, 90 degrees, and you're like, why aren't my tomatoes, there's flowers, but I'm not getting fruit anymore. If you've used those heirloom varieties, that might be the problem. So I know, I'm sure Maxine is the same. I want tomatoes. So I choose varieties that I know that's not going to be an issue. And that's why I use things like the Juliet or the Celebrity, because I know it doesn't, you know, those are pretty tough plants. And whatever I do to them, they usually will survive. So Maxine, did you want to mention anything on that?
Oh, just on the tomatoes, we do a variety of different tomatoes. So we start early with like the Cherokee purples, because those are my husband's favorite. And then we'll come in and probably actually in just a couple weeks, I'll be planting some of the heat tolerant varieties like Solar Fire, and there's a 4th of July variety. There's a ton of different varieties out there, but I know we get really, really hot in our raised bed, and it's also just Florida heat in general. So we plant varieties at different times specifically to accommodate that, and we usually end up with tomatoes clear into the fall.
Yeah. Somebody had asked if we recommend sprouting seeds first. It really depends on what the seed is. So if you're, you know, if you're using something like a tomato, I do start my tomatoes indoors, and she's got cardboard egg trays. Those work great. The peppers I start indoors. Things like squash, your pumpkins, you don't have to. You certainly could start those outside now. Okra, you could start now outside. So it kind of depends on when you want to plant it and how much effort you want to put into it. With the sprouting seeds indoors, I will tell you the one thing I think people struggle with that is making sure that they get enough light. So once you put them in, like an egg carton, or, you know, you're using the little to-go clamshells, whatever you're using, even if it's in a window, if you see them start to stretch, they're not getting enough light. And so I'd say that's probably the biggest problem. And I know last year I had to restart mine because I had that problem. They just did not get enough light where I put them initially. So. All right.
Also, if you're going to start them at inside too, it's really important to make sure you get them into similar growing conditions as to what you're going to put them in outside, because they'll just shrivel up and die on you if you put them out in that hot heat after they've been indoors for a month or 2 months while you're getting them up and ready. So make sure you're hardening them off and giving them time to adjust, because that's tough on them when they're young transplants.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have a seed light tray table, so I move them from that. Then they go outside to kind of an oak tree area, and then they get moved to more full sun. But we've lost most of our cucumbers this year. They just didn't make that transition well. But I don't say you're getting late, but depending on what you're growing, like Maxine had mentioned, it depends on when you want to harvest it. If you want to go ahead and harvest, tomatoes in the next few weeks, then you probably should go ahead and find some plants. But if you're willing to wait a little bit, then yes, you certainly can start those. Yeah. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so the last thing that we want to talk about is some of you guys may already be in this program, but this is our Victory 2020 Garden community that we're promoting this year through, everybody's stuck at home. And so we've got several different options for you to participate if you want to. We would love to hear from you as you move through, your gardening experience. But if you join this group, you can see the link at the bottom. And Maxine, would you put it back in the chat box for me so they can click on it? So we have a private Facebook group where we're sharing ideas. It's called the Victory Gardeners. Once you sign up, you can look for that, and we'll get you in the group. There's online modules on how to grow your own food, and there'll be options for youth and adults on there. So it's kind of got a nice mix, and it really walks you through most of this stuff. And so that's again an online course that you'll have access to. We also have, through that Facebook page, that's where we'll be answering, a lot of these questions that you guys were asking today, about heat or composting, things like that. That's where we'll be posting a lot of that information, where it's very timely. You're working on your stuff that morning, something comes up, you need some answers. It's an easy way to get a hold of Maxine and myself. So we'll be monitoring those. We just posted a video on how to make grow buckets on there that one of our 4-H members did. So, again, easy information, stuff you can access. It's meant to be, what can I do now in my yard when we're all stuck at home, kind of stuff. We'll also have some garden challenges. We want to see what your garden looks like. So maybe you guys are doing something really cool. We would love to see those. We'd like to see your compost piles, for instance, and your trellises. And, the Facebook group is Victory Gardeners. And then, and that's through the Columbia County Extension Office, by the way. We also have a book club. We'll be partnering with our State Master Gardener Office doing the Foodscape Revolution by Bree Arthurs. And so that's going to be really exciting. We'll have some private discussion as well, but she'll be actually joining us. She'll be making the discussion questions and then joining us for that last chapter to kind of wrap up the book. And then for our Junior Master Gardeners, that's JMG. For our youth, I think we're going to start with Roots and Tops, which is a short children's book. We'll have some discussion questions, but we have a lot of people in that group that are younger, and 8 years and younger, and so they will enjoy that. And then also through that community, we are starting to send out seeds to everybody, and you'll also get a poster for your garden. So it's going to be a fun group. We're excited about it. We're getting it started really this week, getting things going. We have about 230 people that have signed up already. So come and join us, and we'd love to hear from you. Again, you can reach out to Maxine or myself. And here's our contact information for you guys. You can email us. Again, Facebook page. We've got the Columbia County Extension Office Facebook page. You can always message me there. Maxine, what's the best way to get a hold of you if they want to do Facebook? Do you guys have a Facebook page or
Yep, we have the IFAS Marion County Master Gardener Facebook page. So, and we've got a significant number of followers. So, shouldn't have any problems finding it. Just look up IFAS Marion County Master Gardeners on Facebook. It'll pop right up. If you do have any problems finding it, just send me an email and I'll find a way to either send you an invite or add a link.
Yeah. And, if you guys have ideas for if there's classes you want to see or short videos or, Facebook Live groups, anything like that, we're always welcome, open to ideas. We're all kind of, like I said, stuck at home and wanting to garden and share the experience. So let us know. Don't be shy and reach out to us because we'll certainly, if I get the question more than once, if I get it twice, that means that a lot of people have that question, and we'll certainly get some information out there for you guys on it. If anybody else have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat box now. And if not, I think that's the end of our first class.